The fire had taken everything by the time the sun came up. Caden Voss stood at the edge of what had been the Hargrove boarding house and watched the last of the smoke curl upward into a pale October sky. The building was gone. Not damaged, not gutted, gone. What remained was a skeleton of black timber and wet ash, the kind of ruin that makes a man understand, maybe for the first time in his life, just how little separates shelter from nothing. He was 19 years old. He had no family, no savings, no possessions beyond the coat he was wearing, a too large thing he had grabbed from a fleeing neighbor in the chaos of the night, and the clothes on his back, which still smelled of smoke so thick it felt like the fire had followed him out. He stood very still. Around him, the other boarders wept or argued or drifted away in small, stunned groups. A woman clutched a tin box to her chest and rocked back and forth on her heels. Two men argued about whose lantern had started it. Nobody looked at Caden. He was used to that. In Providence, Missouri, the Voss name had a way of making people look somewhere else. He reached into the front pocket of his trousers and felt the coin there. A single silver dollar, smooth and cold against his fingers. He had been saving it for 2 months, setting aside a nickel here and a dime there from his wages in the boarding house kitchen. He had not yet decided what it was for. He only knew it felt important to have something solid when the world felt uncertain. Now the world had made its position very clear. He closed his fingers around the dollar and turned away from the ruins. The morning air was sharp and damp, carrying the smell of the river that ran along the western edge of town, that wide, brown, indifferent stretch of the Missouri that had been flowing past Providence long before the town existed and would be flowing long after it was gone. Caden had grown up beside that river. He had spent his boyhood on its banks, learning its moods, learning the way it moved differently in spring than in autumn, learning that it did not care about the people who lived beside it. He had always found that comforting in a strange way. The river's indifference was honest. He walked into town. Providence in the early morning was a different place than it was at midday. The storefronts were still shuttered, the boardwalks empty except for a few men heading to the mill or the grain warehouse at the far end of River Street. The maple trees that lined the main road had gone fully orange and red, and the wind came through them in slow, heavy gusts that sent the leaves scraping across the packed dirt like dry whispers. Caden tried the general store first. Harlan Greer, who owned it, was a compact man with a face that had settled into permanent suspicion sometime around his 40th birthday and never quite recovered. He was stacking flour sacks behind the counter when Caden came in, and he listened to the request, steady work, anything at all in exchange for wages and a place to sleep, with the expression of a man being asked something slightly distasteful. "I know who you are," Greer said, which was not an answer to the question, but was in Providence a complete answer to everything. The feed store was next, then the cooperage on the south end of town where a man named Beaumont was already turning barrel staves in the cold morning air. Beaumont at least had the decency to look apologetic. "I've got nothing right now," he said. "Maybe in the spring." Spring was 5 months away. Caden nodded and kept walking. He tried the grain warehouse, the livery stable, a woman named Mrs. Featherstone who sometimes hired young men to help with her laundry service. Mrs. Featherstone opened her door 4 inches, looked at him for a long moment, and said she was fully staffed. By the time he reached the far end of the main street, the town was waking up fully, and Caden had learned the same lesson from 8 different people in 8 different ways. Providence was a town of about 400 souls, and every one of those souls knew the name Voss. They knew it the way you know the name of a place where something bad happened. Not with malice exactly, but with a reflexive caution, the way you step around a dark patch on a frozen pond without quite knowing why. Jonas Voss, Caden's father, had been a carpenter. A good one by all accounts. His hands could read a piece of wood the way a scholar reads a page. He had built furniture and repaired buildings and taken on small contracts throughout the county. For a while when Caden was very young, there had been enough. Not comfort exactly, but sufficiency. And then there had been nothing. Caden had been 6 years old the year his father's business collapsed. He did not understand it at the time, and did not understand it fully even now. What he knew was that one autumn, everything his father had built, the small workshop, the supply of seasoned lumber, the contracts he had been promised, had simply ceased to exist. Debts appeared from nowhere. Creditors materialized at the door. His father, a quiet man who communicated more easily with wood than with words, had grown quieter still. Then one morning had kissed Caden on top of his head. left him in the care of a neighbor woman named Bess, and walked out of Providence. He had not come back. Caden had grown up with Bess, who was kind but poor and stretched thin across too many obligations. He had worked since he was 12. He had learned to be useful, to be unobtrusive, to ask for nothing. He had also learned that the name Voss carried a weight that had nothing to do with him personally, a reputation for failure, for foolishness, for reaching beyond what was rightfully yours and ending up with less than you started with. He had spent 19 years quietly trying to disprove that reputation. And now he was standing on the main street of Providence with a silver dollar in his pocket, no roof over his head, and 8 rejections behind him before 9 in the morning. He stopped walking. Across the street between the chandler's shop and the edge of a vacant lot, he could see the river. Or rather, he could see what the river had left behind, the shape of the celestial star, sitting motionless in the shallows about a quarter-mile downstream, half swallowed by mud and reeds. The old paddle steamer listed hard to the left, its starboard wheel shattered down to the hub, its upper deck sagging like the brim of a hat left out in the rain. It had been there for 20 years. It would probably be there for 20 more. He had walked past it 1,000 times without really seeing it. He saw it now. The county clerk's office was on the second floor of a brick building that also housed the notary and a dentist who kept irregular hours. The stairs creaked under Caden's boots as he climbed them. A smell of old paper and pipe tobacco drifted down to meet him. Silas Ware had been the county clerk for longer than most people in Providence had been alive. He was a thin man, white-haired, with the slightly telescoped look of someone who has spent decades hunched over a desk. His office was a monument to accumulated paperwork ledgers, stacked in crooked towers folders, tied with ribbon drawers that had not closed properly in years because of what was stuffed inside them. He looked up when Caden came in, recognized him, and said nothing. This was progress by Providence standards. "I want to ask about the Celestial Star," Caden said. "The wreck on the river." Silas Ware regarded him with the expression of a man who has heard a great many requests and learned to withhold his reaction until he understood what was actually being asked. "What about it? Is there a lien on it, back taxes?" The clerk turned slowly in his chair and pulled a ledger from the middle of a stack, with the practiced ease of a man who knows exactly where everything is, despite all appearances to the contrary. He opened it, ran a finger down a column of faded entries, and stopped. He was quiet for a moment. "Dollar," he said. Caden looked at him. "Back taxes," Silas said. $1 even. It's been sitting on the rolls for 11 years. Nobody's ever bothered to pay it because nobody in their right mind would want—" He stopped himself. He looked at Caden with something that was not quite pity and not quite respect, but existed somewhere in the uncertain territory between them. "Because nobody wanted the boat," he finished. Caden reached into his pocket and set the silver dollar on the counter. The sound it made, that clean, bright ring of metal on wood, seemed unusually loud in the small office. Silas Ware looked at the coin. He looked at Caden. He looked back at the coin. Then he reached for his pen. The scratch of the nib on paper was the only sound in the room. Silas Ware wrote slowly and deliberately, the way a man writes when he understands that what he is writing down will matter. He blotted the entry, reached into a drawer, and produced a deed of sale that was brittle at the edges from age. He filled in the relevant information, stamped it with the county seal, and pushed it across the counter. Caden picked it up. The paper felt impossibly thin for something that now represented everything he owned in the world. Silas Ware did not speak again immediately. He took the silver dollar, held it for a moment, and then placed it carefully in the strongbox beneath his desk. When he straightened up, something in his expression had changed. The official blankness was still there, but underneath it, visible now, the way a current is visible beneath still water, was something else. Something that looked a great deal like fear. He leaned slightly forward, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to just above a whisper. "Someone came by asking about that vessel last week," he said. "Not a riverman, not anyone looking to salvage it. A man I recognized. One of Mayor Dodd's people." He paused. "I don't know what's on that boat, son, but somebody does. You be careful." Before Caden could respond, Silas Ware had already turned back to his ledger, his pen moving again, his face resettled into its official blankness, as though the moment of honesty had never occurred. Caden folded the deed and tucked it inside his coat next to his chest and went back down the stairs. Mayor Harlan Dodd was waiting for him on the boardwalk. This did not appear to be a coincidence. Dodd was a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that fills a room even when the room is outdoors. He was 58 years old, well-dressed in the way of men who want you to notice that they are well-dressed, and he held a short cigar in one gloved hand with the ease of a man who has never had to think about what a cigar costs. His face was broad and florid, the face of a man who ate well and slept soundly undisturbed by the kind of thoughts that kept smaller men awake. He smiled when he saw Caden. "Voss," he said, as though the name were a mild observation about the weather. "Heard about the fire? Terrible thing. Providence takes care of its own, of course." He said this without any apparent awareness of the irony given that the town had spent the morning declining to take care of Caden in any practical sense. Caden said nothing. He had learned early that silence was a useful tool in conversations where the other person was going to say what they meant to say regardless. Dodd's smile held, but something behind it sharpened slightly the way a man's eyes change when he realizes a card game is not going the way he expected. "I heard you were up visiting old Silas," Dodd continued, "asking about the wreck." He drew on a cigar, let the smoke out slowly. "I'll save you some time. I've been meaning to have that vessel removed. Public nuisance. Eyesore. I could arrange to have someone take the deed off your hands right now, $20 cash in hand. More than fair considering what the thing is worth. $20. Caden calculated quickly and involuntarily. $20 was 2 months of wages at the boarding house. $20 was the difference between a winter with a roof and a winter without one. $20 was by almost any measure a reasonable offer for a rotting riverboat sunk in mud. "No," he said. Dodd studied him with a different kind of attention, now the attention a man gives to something unexpected, something that doesn't fit the pattern he has established for how the world works. "Think it over," Dodd said pleasantly. "The offer stands." He flicked ash from his cigar onto the boardwalk, a small casual gesture that managed to communicate contempt without quite rising to the level of rudeness. "Your father thought he knew what was best for himself, too. Didn't work out particularly well for him. He said it lightly, the way you might mention the weather in a different city. Matter of fact. Informational. And yet the mention of Jonas Voss, specific, deliberate, delivered with that particular lightness that is the mark of someone who knows exactly what they are saying, landed like a stone dropped into still water." Dodd nodded pleasantly and walked away. Caden stood on the boardwalk and watched him go, and understood with the clarity that sometimes comes from shock that he had just been threatened. Not warned. Threatened. There was a difference, and he was old enough to know it. He also understood that a man like Harlan Dodd did not make $20 offers for something he considered worthless. The question was what the boat was worth to a man who already had everything. The path to the riverbank wound down through a stand of cottonwoods that had gone skeletal in the autumn cold, their white bark catching the pale midday light. The ground was soft and gave slightly under Caden's boots, the soil dark with river damp. He found her sitting on a driftwood log at the bend where the path met the water's edge, an old woman in a heavy wool coat, her fingers working through a fishing net with the slow automatic expertise of someone who has performed the same task for 50 years. She had the dark, weathered look of a person who had lived most of her life outdoors, and her eyes, when she looked up at him, were the color of the river itself, a deep, clouded gray-brown that seemed to hold more depth than should have been possible. Old May Dunbar. She lived in a plank-built shack about a half-mile downriver and was regarded by Providence with the specific combination of wariness and grudging respect that small towns reserve for those who exist outside their systems entirely. She was known to be old, nobody was quite sure how old, and to know the river in ways that went beyond the practical into something less explicable. She did not appear surprised to see him. "You bought the Star," she said. "Not a question." "Word travels fast," Caden said. "Word on the river always does." She pulled a knot tight in the net and smoothed it with her thumb. "Dodd stopped you on the way out." "You saw that?" "I didn't need to see it." She looked up at him fully then, and there was something in her gaze that made him feel slightly transparent, as though she were reading something printed on the inside of his chest. "He's wanted what's on that boat for a long time. He hasn't gone after it himself because he's afraid of what he'd have to answer for going down there. A man who creates a wreck doesn't go digging through the wreck. Too many questions." Caden felt the word land. Creates. "What does that mean?" he asked. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she returned to her net. It means go carefully, she said. And don't go alone. She said nothing more. Caden waited, then understood that was all she was going to give him. It was more than he had expected and considerably more than he knew what to do with. He continued down to the water's edge. The celestial star was worse up close than it looked from a distance. Most things were, but the riverboat had a particular quality of ruin that went beyond mere deterioration. It was the ruin of something that had once been genuinely grand, and grandeur in decay has a specific gravity to it, a heaviness that new things never have. The boat had been a working stern-wheel steamer, once capable of carrying passengers and cargo up and down the Missouri on the kind of schedule that kept towns connected and commerce moving. Now it lay heeled over in the shallows, its hull buried in mud, to a depth that made it unclear where the boat ended and the riverbank began. The main deck was a catastrophe of broken and sagging planks, green with moss, slick with river damp. Sections had collapsed entirely, leaving gaps that dropped into darkness. The upper deck had partially separated from its supports on the port side and hung at an angle that suggested it was held in place more by habit than by structural integrity. The pilot house at the very top was gone, blown off, or rotted away, leaving only the stub of the wheel column pointing at the sky like an accusation. Caden picked his way along the bank until he found where the gangplank had once been. There was nothing there now but a muddy depression and the remnant of a cleat still attached to the hull. He found a broken spar on the bank and used it to test the mud around the hull until he located a section of deck close enough to the waterline to step onto without going in past his knees. He pulled himself up. The deck shifted slightly under his weight, a slow, yielding movement, like stepping onto ice that is not quite frozen through. He waited. It steadied. He moved carefully toward the center of the boat, stepping over gaps, testing each plank before committing his weight to it. The wood was gray and soft, in most places the fibers broken down to something that looked like wood, but had the structural properties of wet cork. He was concentrating on his footing, which is why he didn't notice the dog immediately. When he looked up, it was simply there, sitting at the edge of the main cabin entrance, watching him. A medium-sized animal built lean with a coat that might have been brown or black under the grime, but was currently the uniform gray of something that had been living outdoors through the wrong seasons. Its ribs were visible. Its eyes were the color of river water in late afternoon, a clear amber-touched brown that contained an unsettling degree of attention. It did not bark. It did not retreat. It watched him with the quiet patience of something that has learned that most things in the world are either dangerous or useless, and has become very good at determining which is which. Caden reached into the coat pocket. Not his coat. He reminded himself a borrowed coat, but it had belonged to someone who appreciated a practical pocket, and found a piece of dried biscuit he had put there that morning and forgotten. He broke off half and held it out. The dog looked at his hand, looked at his face, looked at his hand again. Then it came forward and took the biscuit with a delicacy that seemed almost deliberate, as though it wanted to demonstrate that it understood the difference between hunger and desperation. It chewed, swallowed, sat back, and continued watching him. Caden ate the other half of the biscuit himself. Cinder, he said, because the dog needed a name, and because there was something about the animal, its coloring, or the way it had appeared out of the wreck, like something conjured from the remnants of a fire that made the name fit. The dog's ears moved slightly. Not confirmation exactly, but acknowledgement. He moved deeper into the boat. The main cabins were what he had expected, flooded at some point, and left that way, the interiors thick with dried river silt doors hanging open, or gone entirely, personal effects long since stolen or rotted to nothing. He moved through them quickly, not looking for anything specific, trying to understand the shape of what he owned. It was the stern that changed his understanding of what he was dealing with. He had worked his way to the aft section of the main deck when he saw at the door to the captain's quarters. It was set into the aft bulkhead of the main cabin structure, slightly higher than the surrounding deck level, on what appeared to be a raised foundation of thicker timber. And unlike every other door on the Celestial Star, which had either collapsed, swung permanently open, or been reduced to scattered lumber, this one was closed. Not just closed, seated tight in its frame, flush and level, showing no sign of warp or sag, despite 20 years of humidity flooding and the slow grinding movement of the boat's weight against the riverbed. Caden moved closer. The hardware was the first thing that struck him as wrong. Not wrong in the sense of broken, but wrong in the sense of impossible. The hinges were heavy forged iron, 3 of them, running the full height of the door, and they were dark. Not rust dark, black, clean and almost entirely free of the orange decay that had consumed every other iron fitting on the vessel. The lock plate was heavy brass turned deep green-brown by oxidation, but intact, its mechanism clearly functional. Its keyhole a precise dark slot that showed no sign of tampering. He ran his fingers along the frame. The wood here was dense, harder than the surrounding structure, the grain tight in the way of timber that had been very carefully selected and very well sealed before it was ever put to use. Someone had built this door to last. Not to last like a good front door lasts 10 years, 20 years with maintenance. To last like a bank vault lasts. He crouched and examined the gap at the bottom of the door. Less than a quarter inch, bone dry on the inside. He stood and looked at the lock plate more carefully. In the lower right corner, almost invisible under the patina of age, was a small marking. He scraped at it carefully with his thumbnail until the grime came away and the shape beneath became clear. 2 letters finely engraved in a personal script that had nothing to do with a manufacturer's mark ER. Elias Rowe, captain of the Celestial Star, the man who had disappeared in 1864, 20 years before this morning, taking with him, according to the story that had calcified into local legend, the boat's payroll, the trust of his employers, and any explanation for why the vessel had never moved again. Caden stood before that door for a long moment. The river moved softly against the hull below him. Cinder padded up beside him and sat nose pointed at the base of the sealed door and let out a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a growl, something in between the sound of a creature acknowledging the presence of something it cannot categorize. The door had been built to protect something. It had been protecting it for 20 years. And Mayor Harlan Dodd, who had $20 in his pocket for a rotting hull, had sent someone to look at this boat just last week. Caden placed his palm flat against the door. The wood was cold and smooth and utterly unyielding beneath his hand. He thought about what old May had said, a man who creates a wreck doesn't go digging through the wreck, and felt the shape of something he couldn't yet name begin to assemble itself in the back of his mind. Night was coming on fast now, the sky above the river going the deep blue-gray of a bruise, the cottonwoods on the bank turning to black shapes against a fading sky. Caden had no blanket, no lamp, no food beyond the half biscuit he had already eaten. He had a borrowed coat and the deed to a wreck folded inside it. He had nothing else. He found a section of the upper deck on the starboard side protected from the wind, the planking still solid enough to hold weight, and sat down against the wall of the upper cabin with his knees drawn up and his collar turned against the cold. Below him, the river moved with its slow, indifferent authority, carrying the last of the light downstream. Cinder came and lay against his legs without being invited. The animal was warm, which was something. From the bank across the dark water, a light moved through the cottonwoods. A lantern carried by someone who was walking slowly enough to suggest they were not in any particular hurry, or someone who was trying very hard to look like they weren't. The light paused at the point where the bank gave the best view of the stern of the Celestial Star. It stayed there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then it moved away back through the trees, back toward town, and was gone. Caden watched the darkness where it had been until there was nothing to watch. He was not alone on this river. He had known that since Silas Ware had whispered his warning across the clerk's counter. But knowing it and seeing the proof of it were different things. And as he sat on the cold deck of his broken boat in the first night of what was shaping up to be a very difficult life, he understood with a clarity that cut through everything else that whatever was behind that sealed door in the captain's quarters had not been forgotten. It had been watched. And now, for the first time in 20 years, someone had gone down there and stayed. The river talked to itself in the dark, moving around the hull of the Celestial Star with soft, persistent sounds. A gurgle here, a hollow knock there, where a piece of driftwood bumped the bow. Caden listened to it without quite hearing it, his mind turning over the day's events the way his father had once turned over pieces of wood, before committing to a cut, looking for the grain, looking for the direction things wanted to go. A man who creates a wreck. $20 for a hull full of mud, someone asking about the star last week, and a door that had stood for 20 years without giving an inch. He closed his hand around the deed inside his coat. The paper crinkled softly. The river kept moving. Cinder's breathing slowed and deepened beside him. Above, the stars were coming out one by one through gaps in the cloud cover. Cold points of light, indifferent as the river, indifferent as the town. And somewhere in the dark, behind Caden Voss, the celestial star settled slightly deeper into the mud, as though bracing itself for whatever was coming next. The first morning came gray and cold. Caden woke before dawn with his back stiff against the cabin wall and Cinder pressed against his side, the dog's warmth, the only thing that had kept the night from being completely unbearable. His breath came out in small clouds. The river below was invisible in the early dark present, only a sound, that low, continuous conversation of water moving over mud and around obstacles, a sound that had no beginning and no end, and no particular concern for the people who lived beside it. He sat still for a moment and took inventory. One borrowed coat, the clothes on his back, a folded deed pressed against his chest, the cold, wet smell of a boat that had been dying slowly for 2 decades. And somewhere aft of where he was sitting behind a sealed door that had no business being as solid as it was, something that a man like Harlan Dodd wanted badly enough to send people looking. That was what he had. That was everything. He stood, worked the stiffness out of his shoulders, and began. The first thing he needed was a lever. He spent the early morning moving through the accessible parts of the boat with the deliberate, unhurried attention his father had taught him, not looking for anything specific, but letting the structure of the thing reveal itself to him. Gradually, the way a piece of wood reveals its grain when you hold it at the right angle to the light. He tested planks with his boot before committing his weight to them. He noted which sections of the hull were still in contact with solid ground and which were floating free, suspended over mud or open water. He found what he needed in the shattered remains of the portside paddle wheel, a length of white oak that had been part of the wheel's structural framing, roughly 6 feet long and dense enough that it barely flexed when he put his weight across it. Getting it free from the wreckage took most of an hour, his hands raw against the wet wood, his boots sinking into mud that gripped with a determined suction every time he shifted his weight. When it finally came loose, he sat for a moment in the mud, with the timber across his lap, breathing hard. Cinder watched from the bank, head tilted slightly. "I know," Caden said. He carried the timber back to the captain's door. His father had taught him something fundamental about resistance, that fighting it directly was almost always the wrong approach. A stubborn joint did not yield to force, it yielded to understanding. You had to find the specific point where the material was asking to move, and then you helped it move there. And the thing that had seemed immovable came apart almost of its own accord. He applied this to the hinges. The top hinge was his first target. He wedged the thin end of the oak timber into the gap between the hinge plate and the door frame, a gap so small it barely existed, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, and began to work it. Not pushing hard, moving it, back and forth, the way you work a splinter out of skin, patiently, without forcing, letting the motion do what direct pressure cannot. The first hour produced nothing visible. The second hour produced a sound, a faint, high-pitched complaint from somewhere inside the hinge mechanism, the sound of iron that had been still for a very long time, being asked to remember how to move. The third hour produced a flake of rust the size of a thumbnail, which fell from the joint and landed on the deck planking with a sound so small it should not have been audible. But he heard it. He stopped and looked at the joint. The gap had widened fractionally, perhaps a 32nd of an inch. Not visible to the eye. Detectable only by running his fingertip along the edge and feeling the slight increase in the step between plate and frame. It was enough. It meant the hinge was no longer monolithic. It had a memory now of having moved, and memory in metal, as in men, makes the second movement easier than the first. He kept going. By the end of the first day, his palms were raw where the timber had worked against them. The skin raised in blisters that broke and wept and began hardening almost immediately, the way the hands of someone raised to work will respond to a new demand. He tore strips from the tail of his shirt, not the borrowed coat which he needed intact against the cold, and wrapped his palms. And when that was soaked through, he tore more strips, and by evening his shirt was shortened by 6 inches, and his hands felt like something that had been partially rebuilt from less cooperative materials. He ate nothing that day. He drank from the river upstream of the hull where the water ran clearer. Cinder disappeared in the afternoon and came back with something small and dead in his mouth, which he deposited near Caden's feet with the air of someone who has completed a practical task and expects acknowledgement. Caden acknowledged it. He even managed to cook it using a fragment of lens glass from a broken lantern he found in the main cabin to catch the thin afternoon sun and coax a small fire from a pile of dry rot he had scraped from the interior walls. It was not much of a meal. It was better than nothing, which was the alternative. That night he slept better than the first. Exhaustion has a way of simplifying things. The second day was when things became complicated. He was working the lower hinge the top one had given him, another fractional gap overnight, the cold contraction of the metal helping where the heat of the day could not. When he heard footsteps on the gangplank section he had rigged from a fallen timber between the bank and the hull. He did not look up immediately. He finished the stroke of the lever, set it carefully against the wall, and then turned around. The man standing on the deck was perhaps 30 broad in the way of someone who did heavy work, with a face that was pleasant enough in its individual components, but added up to something that Caden couldn't quite trust. He was wearing workman's clothes, but they were too clean for someone who had actually been working, and his boots, which were good leather, had not been broken in the way working boots get broken in. "Heard you were doing some work out here," the man said. His voice was easy and friendly in the way of someone who has practiced making it easy and friendly. "Name's Cleet Marsh. I do repair work on river vessels. Salvage sometimes. Thought maybe you could use an extra pair of hands." Caden looked at him. "Free of charge," Marsh added. "Consider it a neighborly gesture." There are moments when a person understands something without being able to articulate the mechanism of the understanding, when the sum of small observations becomes a conclusion before the conscious mind has caught up with the arithmetic. The boots, the clean clothes, the specific mention of salvage. The fact that he had appeared on the second day as though someone had decided that watching from the bank was no longer sufficient. "That's generous," Caden said. "What do you know about sternwheel mechanics?" Marsh blinked. The question had not been in the script he had prepared. "Enough," he said. "What's the typical clearance between the wheel shaft and the keelson frame on a Missouri River packet?" A half-second pause. "Depends on the boat." "It does," Caden agreed. He picked up his lever. "I'm fine on my own, but I appreciate the offer." He turned back to the door and resumed working. Marsh stood on the deck for another minute. Caden could feel the man's attention on his back, assessing, recalibrating. Then the footsteps moved away, back toward the gangplank, back toward the bank. Caden kept his face toward the door until the sound of the footsteps had completely faded. Then he set down the lever and stood still for a long moment thinking. A man who knew nothing about sternwheel mechanics offering free salvage work, arriving on day 2. Dodd's patience, it seemed, had limits. He moved to the starboard side of the upper deck that evening, a different position than the previous nights, with a clear sightline to both the gangplank approach and the bank. He did not sleep deeply. Sometime after midnight, he heard it, the careful, deliberate sound of someone trying to move quietly across the main deck below. He waited. The sound moved aft toward the captain's quarters. It stopped near the door. He heard the scratch of metal on metal, someone probing the lock with something. Then a pause. Then a different sound, the dull percussion of something being struck against the hull planking nearby, exploratory, like a man sounding for a hollow space. Caden came down the companionway stairs in 3 fast, quiet steps, the oak timber in his hand. Cleet Marsh was crouched near the base of the aft cabin wall, a short iron rod in his hand. His lantern shuddered to a thin slit of light. He looked up when he heard Caden and had approximately 1 second to register what was happening, before Caden planted the timber against the deck in front of him, with a crack that carried across the water like a gunshot. "Get off my boat," Caden said. The voice was quiet. It was not a request. Marsh got off the boat. The third day, the top hinge pin moved. Not fractionally, not detectably, only by touch. It actually moved, a visible translation of the iron pin upward through its barrel, accompanied by a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a shriek. A sound of metal remembering how to give way after years of refusal. Caden stopped. He breathed. Then he went back to work. By midday, the pin was free and the top of the door sagged inward, its weight transferring to the lower hinge and the lock. He worked the lower hinge through the afternoon and it came faster. The principle was the same, and the timber now had a groove worn into it from 3 days of use, and his hands, for all that they hurt, had found their grip. The lower hinge gave as the sun was touching the tree line across the river, and the door hung suspended from its lock alone, canted at an angle that left a gap at the top wide enough to put his forearm through. Through that gap came a smell that stopped him completely. It was the smell of enclosed dry air that had been sealed away from the river and the seasons for a very long time. Paper leather, the faint ghost of lamp oil, and something else beneath all of it, something harder to name. the smell of a place that had been carefully maintained and then perfectly preserved in the state of its maintenance. Not decay, not ruin. Something closer to suspension, a room that had been waiting, not dying. He stood in front of that gap and breathed that air, and understood in a way he hadn't quite until this moment that whatever was on the other side of this door was real. Not rumor, not legend, real and intact and waiting. The lock was the final problem. He examined it for a full hour, probing the keyhole with a length of wire he had straightened from a broken hinge on one of the main cabin doors. It was a high-quality tumbler mechanism, the kind that went into bank doors and strong rooms, not into riverboat cabins. Someone had special ordered this lock and installed it with the same care and intention that had gone into every other element of this door. He could not pick it. He lacked the tools, and more critically, he lacked the years of practice that picking a lock of this quality would have required. He sat back against the opposite wall and stared at the door and accepted this fact without argument. He needed another approach. The logbook was in a crate in the forward section of the main cabin, half buried under a collapse of shelf timber that must have come down in one of the floods that had periodically inundated the lower decks over the past 2 decades. Caden had noticed it on his first full day aboard, but set it aside, the cover so swollen with water damage that it had looked like a solid block of material rather than a book. Now he took it back to his sleeping spot on the upper deck and worked at it carefully, using the flat edge of the wire to separate the pages from the outside and peeling them apart with the slow patience of someone diffusing something delicate. Most of it was gone. The ink had bloomed and dissolved into abstract shapes that might have been letters or might have been water stains. It was impossible to tell, and he did not waste time trying. He worked toward the back of the book where the pages were protected from both ends and might have fared better. They had. The last 8 pages were held between the back cover and a thick inner leaf of dense leather, and while they were damp and stiff, the writing was legible. The final entries were dated from April of 1864, and they were the entries of a man in a particular kind of trouble, careful, controlled on the surface, but with something underneath the measured professional language that felt like a man keeping his handwriting steady through an effort of will. Cargo manifests, river conditions, crew notes, and then on the last page a single entry that was different in character from everything before it, shorter, more personal, written in a slightly different pressure of pen, as though the hand had been less certain. The key is in the heart of the promise. Eleanor knows. If I do not reach her, find the star. Find the room. The men who stop me will know what they have done. Let what is inside prove it. Caden read it 3 times. The key is in the heart of the promise. He looked at the logbook cover. It was heavy, the outer leather thick and rigid with a central emblem pressed into it, a stylized 8-pointed star, the symbol of the celestial star line. He pressed his thumb against it, felt the rigidity of the emblem itself, felt now that he was paying attention that it was slightly stiffer than the surrounding leather. Not just because of the embossing. He took out the wire. He ran it carefully along the edge of the emblem, probing. Found a seam thin as a thread running around the interior edge of the raised design. He worked the wire around the full perimeter of the seam, and when he had gone all the way around, he used his thumbnail to lift the edge of the embossed star, and it came away a separate layer of leather glued, but not bonded, set over a recess cut into the board beneath. In the recess, flat and cold and shaped with the precision of something made by a very good locksmith, was a small iron key. Caden held it in his palm and looked at it for a long moment. It was an ordinary-looking thing. Just iron, just a key. But it had been hidden here for 20 years, and the man who hid it had been gone for 20 years, and the door it was meant for had been standing sealed against the river and the weather, and whoever had been watching the boat from the bank all this time. He went aft. The key slid into the lock with the smoothness of something made for exactly this purpose. No hesitation, no resistance, just the quiet, clean alignment of precisely fitted parts. He turned it. The sound the lock made was a single deep click, resonant and final, like the last word in a very long sentence. The door swung inward. He held the lantern he had rigged from a salvaged tin and a stub of tallow he had found in the main cabin, and he stepped across the threshold. The air hit him first, that sealed, preserved quality he had smelled through the gap, now fully present. Dry, still, carrying the ghost of a life that had been suspended rather than ended. The cabin was small. A narrow bunk built into the starboard wall, its mattress long since collapsed to nothing, but still framed by the wooden rails. A desk bolted to the forward bulkhead, a chair in front of it, both bolted to the floor in the way of furniture meant to survive river conditions. A brass lamp green with oxidation fixed to the wall above the desk. A wooden chart case on the forward wall, its doors closed. Everything was covered in a fine, even layer of dust that had the quality of something settled over a very long time undisturbed. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been touched. The room looked like a stage set for a play that had been interrupted between acts and never resumed. And there beneath the bunk, visible as soon as he crouched and held the lantern low, the chest. It was iron-painted black with a surface pitted and roughened by age, but structurally intact. It was bolted to the oak planking of the floor with 4 heavy bolts set at the corners. The lock on the front face was not a keyhole. It was a dial mechanism, a series of numbered rings set into a brass plate, the kind of combination lock that a man chose when he wanted something to be openable only by someone who knew the specific sequence. The key from the logbook had opened the door. But it would not open this. Caden crouched in front of the chest and ran his fingertips across the iron surface. Near the bottom left corner, almost invisible, was a name engraved in fine script, Eleanor, and beneath it a date, April 16th, 1864. He sat back on his heels and looked at those words, and understood that Captain Elias Rowe had been a man who believed in the power of specificity in encoding what mattered most in the things that were most personal. The key had been in the logbook. The combination was in the date. And the date was the same one on the letter inside the bunkside compartment, which he hadn't found yet, but which he found now when he stood and examined the bunk frame more carefully and pressed on the panel at the head of the bunk and felt it give inward on a hidden pivot. Inside a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been red and was now the faded pink of something that has given most of its color to time. On top of the bundle, a small photograph on tin, the image softened but legible. A woman perhaps 30, with a steady, direct gaze, and the composed expression of someone who understood what was being asked of them when they sat for a portrait. And beneath the photograph, a small envelope, its seal long since brittle and broken by age. Inside the envelope was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was Captain Rowe's. He recognized it from the logbook, but this was different from the logbook entries. Personal. The pressure of the pen, uneven the letters, not quite as controlled, the mark of a man writing quickly and with feeling rather than for the record. He read it. And then he read the second page, which was not part of the letter, but was a separate document, a single sheet of heavier paper written in a different hand, bearing a different date. A date from 1871, 7 years after the letter, 7 years after the boat went silent in the mud. The name at the top of that second page was Jonas Voss. Caden's hands went still. He read what Captain Elias Rowe had written about his father. He read it in the dim, wavering light of a tallow lantern crouched on the floor of a sealed room in a boat that had been waiting 20 years. And he read about a man who had been honest and skilled, and who had been made into a ruin not by his own failings, but by the deliberate, patient machinations of someone who had needed him out of the way. Rowe had known. He had witnessed. He had been preparing to come forward when the boat was delayed, diverted, held in place by forces that had never been satisfactorily explained. And then Rowe had vanished. And Jonas Voss had walked out of Providence 7 years later carrying nothing, leaving his 6-year-old son in the care of a neighbor woman, because the alternative, staying in a town where everything had been taken from him, and the man who had taken it, controlled everything, was a kind of slow destruction that would eventually take the boy too. Caden sat on the floor of the captain's quarters of the Celestial Star, with the paper in his hands and the lantern burning low beside him, and he understood his father for the first time as a man rather than as a memory. A man who had made a specific choice under a specific pressure, and who had perhaps believed that the choice was protective rather than abandoning, and who had perhaps been wrong about that, or perhaps right, and who was not here to ask. He also understood with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the present moment, that the document in his hands was not simply a revelation about the past. It was evidence. He did not try the combination that night. The day had taken everything he had, and the discovery in the hidden compartment had taken something beyond physical, had reached into a part of him that needed time to absorb what it had been given before it could be asked to act on it. He sat in the captain's chair at the desk, the papers in his lap, cinder lying across the threshold of the open door as though standing watch, and he let the river talk to itself in the dark outside. The combination was the date. He was certain of it. April 16th, 1864. Whatever was in the chest had been locked there with the same logic that had locked everything else coded in what was most personal, most specific, most impossible to guess if you didn't know the man. Tomorrow. He would try it tomorrow. But before tomorrow came the storm. It arrived without warning in the deep middle of the night, the way the worst things tend to arrive, not gradually with time to prepare, but all at once, as though the sky had been holding it in reserve and simply decided the moment had come. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in minutes. The wind came first, driving hard from the northwest, hitting the upper structure of the celestial star with a force that made the whole boat shudder and sent loose debris skittering across the deck. Then the rain, horizontal and cold, slashing in under every overhang and through every gap in the damaged structure. And then the river moved. 20 years of settled mud does not give way easily, but it gives way when it has to, and what had been building upstream for days, the slow, invisible accumulation of October rain across 1,000 square miles of Missouri watershed, arrived in the form of a rise that lifted the water level at Providence by 4 feet in less than 2 hours. The mud around the celestial star's hull, loosened by the same water that was now pushing up from beneath, released its grip with a series of low organic sounds like the earth exhaling. The boat moved, not dramatically, not the way a freed vessel might move in a story, just a slow grinding, barely perceptible shift. The stern swinging 10 degrees downstream, the bow bumping against a submerged log it had rested against for years, the whole structure settling into a new and uncertain relationship with the water beneath it. Caden was already awake and already on the upper deck when he heard the sound from the bank. It came through the noise of the storm, thin, high, undeniable. A human voice, then two, then a sound that was not a voice at all, but that he recognized in the specific way that some sounds bypass the brain and speak directly to something older, the sound of a child in the water. He found the rope coil near the forward capstan where he had placed it 2 days earlier, against exactly no particular expectation of needing it. He tied one end to the capstan with a knot his father had taught him, a knot that would hold under load without tightening to the point of being unreleasable. Wrapped the other end twice around his forearm and went over the side. The water was a physical shock, cold so immediate and complete that his lungs locked for 2 full seconds before they remembered how to work. The current, swollen with the night's rain, pushed against him with a steady, impersonal force. He found his footing on the submerged hull shelf of the boat and pushed off from it, letting the rope pay out behind him, moving toward the sound. He found the boy, first small, maybe 7 years old, caught in the debris fan that had formed along the downstream edge of a partially submerged wagon. The child was conscious but could not fight the current. Caden got his arm around the boy's chest and went hand over hand back up the rope, fighting the pull of the current every foot, and got the boy onto the deck and then went back. The girl was older, 10 perhaps, and had managed to get herself partly onto the overturned wagon bed. Caden reached her and she grabbed his arm with both hands and did not let go until they were both on the deck of the celestial star, shaking with cold and effort. The parents, a man and a woman, both large enough to have stayed above water by sheer force of presence, made it to the hull on their own, following the rope, and Caden helped them over the rail. The man was Aldous Carver. He said his name when he had recovered enough breath to say anything, and he said it with the automatic reflex of a man who was raised to introduce himself regardless of circumstances. He was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by outdoor work into something that suggested both stubbornness and reliability. They got the children into the captain's quarters, the driest, most sheltered space on the vessel. Caden gave them his coat, which was wet but still warmer than nothing. He found a piece of canvas in the main cabin and rigged it across the doorframe to cut the wind. He worked without stopping and without quite feeling the cold anymore, which he understood was not because he had warmed up. He was somewhere past the point where cold registers as cold. His body had simply accepted it as the current condition. It was Aldous Carver who, crouching in the captain's quarters while his wife held the children, looked at the chest bolted to the floor beneath the bunk, and then looked at Caden with a question he did not ask out loud. Caden looked at the chest. The storm was roaring outside. The boat was moving beneath them, slow, grinding, unpredictable. The lantern was burning its last half-inch of tallow. He crouched in front of the combination lock. April 16th, 1864. He turned the first dial. 4. The second. 1. 6. The third. 6. 4. He held his breath. The mechanism inside the chest made a sound that was entirely distinct from the noise of the storm, precise and final and deeply, profoundly satisfying. The bolt withdrew. The lid under its own modest weight came fractionally open. Caden sat back on his heels. The children were breathing steadily now, beginning to warm. The rain hammered the roof of the cabin above them. The river moved against the hull with its slow, insistent authority. Aldous Carver looked at the cracked lid of the chest and said nothing, because there was in that moment nothing adequate to say. The celestial star drifted another 2 degrees downstream and shuddered once as though acknowledging something. Then the storm began very slightly, almost imperceptibly, to ease. Dawn came slowly, the way it comes after storms that have taken something from the world, not all at once, not with the clean confidence of an ordinary morning, but in gradual increments of gray light that seemed almost tentative, as though the sky itself was checking first to see what remained. The river had dropped 18 inches by first light, not back to where it had been, that would take days, but enough that the celestial star had settled again into the mud at a new angle 3 degrees further downstream than before, still listing but no longer drifting. The storm had passed westward, taking its noise with it. What remained was the specific silence that follows violence, complete, almost ceremonial, broken only by the drip of water from every surface of the boat and the occasional distant sound of debris moving in the current. Caden sat on the deck outside the captain's quarters, with his back against the cabin wall and his hands open in his lap, and watched the light come up over the eastern tree line across the river. He had not slept. He was not certain he would be able to sleep for some time. Inside the cabin, the Carver family was breathing steadily. The children had finally stopped shaking an hour before dawn. Aldous Carver's wife, her name was Ruth. He had learned, a quiet woman with capable hands and a directness of manner that suggested she had never had the luxury of indirection, had found a piece of dry sailcloth in the chart case and used it as an additional blanket for the children. Aldous himself sat against the bunk, awake, watching the chest. The chest was open. Its lid rested against the bunk frame at an angle, as though it had simply grown tired of being closed. Caden had not yet looked inside it fully. He had seen enough in the first moment after the lock had given way and the storm was still screaming outside to understand the general nature of what was there. He had closed the lid gently and told Aldous to sleep if he could, and then he had come out here to the deck to sit with the river and think. He had been thinking for 4 hours. Now the light was sufficient and the family was safe, and the time for thinking had ended. He went back inside. He lifted the lid of the chest with both hands and set it fully open against the bunk frame. The interior was lined with oilcloth stitched carefully at the seams and wrapped around the contents in overlapping layers that had kept the inside bone dry, despite everything the river had thrown at the outside for 20 years. He peeled back the layers one at a time, slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who understands that what they are handling is fragile, not in the physical sense, but in the sense of importance, the sense of things that have been waiting a very long time to be seen. The first layer revealed a stack of folded documents tied with shipping cord. Contracts, manifest, receipts, the official record of cargo that the Celestial Star had been carrying when it failed to complete its final delivery in the autumn of 1864. He set them aside. The second layer was what he had seen the edge of the night before, when the lock had given way and the lantern was burning its last light. A collection of documents folded together and bound with a leather strap thicker than the contracts, their paper heavier. He undid the strap. Land deeds. 7 of them. Each one a legal record of property ownership registered with the county, bearing the seal of the state of Missouri. He opened the first one and read the name at the top. Carver. Aldous Carver's father's name in a hand. He didn't recognize the clerk who had drawn up the document, probably, or the surveyor. But the land described was specific and real boundary lines, acreage, the name of the creek that ran along the eastern edge. A piece of ground that someone had paid for and built a life on. He looked up at Aldous Carver. Aldous was watching him with an expression that was very carefully controlled. The expression of a man who has learned not to hope too quickly, because hope that comes too fast is the kind that breaks you when it fails. Caden held out the deed. Aldous took it. He looked at it. He read it once, then again, and then he set it face down on his knee with the precise, deliberate movement of a man who is doing everything in his power not to make a sound. His wife Ruth put her hand on his arm and left it there. Caden went back to the chest. The remaining deeds bore other names: Hutchins, Farwell, Briggs, Delacroix, Wentworth, each one a family name from Providence and the surrounding county, each one attached to land that had changed hands in the years following the failure of the Celestial Star's final run, land that had been acquired by creditors and speculators, and in most cases, ultimately by a holding company that Caden was now certain would trace back through enough layers of paperwork to Harlan Dodd. Beneath the deeds was a leather wallet soft with age, its clasp tarnished but functional. He opened it. Bearer bonds. Printed on heavy bank paper, their engraving still crisp, bearing the seal of the St. Louis Union Bank. He counted them without rushing, laying each one flat on the deck beside the chest as he went. When he was finished, he sat back and looked at what was in front of him and understood that the number was large enough to matter. Not just to him, to a town. And then at the very bottom of the chest, beneath the wallet, a single document separate from the others, folded once and sealed with wax that had cracked with age, but still held the impression of a signet ring. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the paper. It was a single page written in a hand he recognized as Captain Rose, the same controlled, deliberate script from the logbook. But this was not a log entry, and it was not a personal letter. It was a sworn statement dated April 14th, 1864. 2 days before the date encoded in Eleanor's name, 2 days before whatever had happened to stop the Celestial Star from completing its run. It described in the specific language of a man who had understood he might not survive to speak the words aloud what he had witnessed in the weeks before the final voyage. The meetings he had seen, the conversation he had overheard at the Dodd family warehouse on the south end of Providence, where a sum of money had changed hands between Harlan Dodd and two men whose names Roe had not known, but whose faces he had described in enough detail to be recognizable. What that money had been paid for. What instructions had been given. The Celestial Star had not simply failed to arrive. It had been deliberately prevented from arriving. And at the bottom of the statement below Roe's signature was a second signature, a witness. A man who had been present when Roe had written and signed the document. A man who had seen the same meeting, heard the same conversation, and had been willing in April of 1864 to put his name to the truth of it. Silas Ware. Caden stared at that name for a long time. Silas Ware, who had been a young clerk in 1864 and was now an old one. Silas Ware, who had whispered a warning across the counter when he thought no one was listening. Silas Ware, who had spent 20 years in the same office, in the same building, in the same town as the man whose crime he had witnessed and signed his name to, and then for reasons that were not recorded in this document, but were not difficult to imagine, said nothing about. 20 years of silence. He folded the document carefully and placed it in his inside coat pocket, next to where the deed had rested against his chest since the morning he had bought this boat for a silver dollar. Aldous Carver was a practical man. This was apparent in everything about him, the way he assessed situations without dramatizing them, the way he moved, the way he spoke when he spoke, which was carefully and without excess. He had grown up working land that had belonged to his father and that he had believed would belong to him. When that land had been taken from him through what had seemed like the mechanical inevitability of debt and legal process, he had not railed against it. He had become a tenant on the ground he had once owned, and he had worked it the same way he always had because working was the only response he knew. He listened to what Caden told him without interrupting. When Caden finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "Clarksville," he said then. "There's a lawyer there named Josiah Pruitt. My father used him once. He's old now, but he's straight." "How far?" "Half a day by road, less if the river's passable." Aldous looked at his wife and his children, who were awake now and listening with the specific attentiveness of children who understand that what the adults are discussing is important. "Ruth can take the children to her sister's farm. It's 2 miles east. We can go to Clarksville today." Caden thought about the chest. It could not be moved. It was bolted to the floor. What could be moved was what was inside it, and what was inside it needed to be somewhere safer than a boat that had just spent a night drifting. He packed the documents into the oilcloth from the chest lining, wrapped them carefully, and secured the bundle inside his coat against his body. They left the boat in the early morning, the mud of the bank cold and sucking at their boots, and parted ways at the cottonwood stand, Ruth Carver and the children east toward the farm, Caden and Aldous, west toward the road to Clarksville. Josiah Pruitt's office was on the second floor of a building that had been built to last and had succeeded heavy brick deep-set windows floors, that did not creak because they had been laid over beams thick enough to be the floor of a barn. The man himself was in his 70s, white-haired, with a face that had the particular quality of age that comes not from deterioration, but from concentration, as though the decades had removed everything unnecessary and left only what was essential. He listened to the entire account without expression. He examined each document with the unhurried attention of someone who has learned that rushing this part of the process always costs more time than it saves. He held the bearer bonds to the window light, checking the watermarks, running his thumb across the engraving. He read Captain Rowe's sworn statement twice, and when he reached the second signature at the bottom, something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly, but the adjustment of someone who has received a piece of information that reorders what they thought they knew. "Silas Ware," he said quietly. "You know him." "I know of him. Knew his father." Pruitt set the statement down carefully on his desk and folded his hands. "These bonds are genuine. I can verify the registration numbers against the bank's public records, but I have no doubt. The deeds are legitimate, they were filed correctly, the registrations are traceable. Everything here is exactly what it appears to be." He paused. "Which creates a specific problem," he continued. "Harlan Dodd has a relationship with the county court. Not a corrupt one necessarily, or not entirely, but a comfortable one. Men who have known each other a long time and have mutual interests. If you bring this through normal channels through the county court, Dodd will know about it before the ink is dry on the filing. He will have time to respond, to prepare, possibly to move money and documentation in ways that make the connection between him and these events harder to establish." "What's the alternative?" Caden asked. Pruitt looked at him with the expression of a man who has already thought past the question to the answer and is simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. "You don't go through the court first," he said. "You go through the town. Public disclosure before witnesses, before Dodd has any indication of what you have. The law follows the evidence. The evidence has to be seen before it can be buried." He picked up his pen. "I'll come with you," he said. "I haven't been to Providence in 15 years. I believe it's time for a visit." The plan took shape during the 2-hour ride back to Providence, the three men, Caden, Aldous, and Pruitt, in a borrowed buggy, talking through the specifics with the focused practicality of people who understand that the difference between justice and its absence often comes down to sequencing and timing. Providence held a community meeting on the last Monday of every month, a tradition that dated back to the town's founding and that had become, under Mayor Dodd's long tenure, a largely ceremonial affair in which the mayor reported what he had decided and the townspeople listened. The following Monday was 3 days away. Caden had a different kind of meeting in mind. He spent those 3 days doing 3 things. He returned to the Celestial Star once to secure the chest's remaining contents, and once to check the structural condition of the boat after the storm it had settled. But it had held, and the captain's quarters, that sealed and fortified room, was as intact as it had ever been. He visited old May Dunbar at her shack downriver and sat with her for an hour and told her what he had found, and she listened without surprise, as though the river had already told her the general shape of it, and he was only filling in the details. And he called on 5 families in Providence and the surrounding farms, the Hutchins family, the Farwells, the Briggs, the Wentworths, and one other whose name was on a deed in the oilcloth bundle, and spoke to them quietly and privately about what he had in his possession. He did not tell them everything. He told them enough. He told them to come to the town square on Saturday morning, which was not a meeting day, which was not on any official schedule, which would give Dodd no particular reason to expect anything unusual. On Friday evening, Caden found Silas Ware. The old clerk was at home in a small house 2 streets back from the main road, a tidy place with a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter, its beds covered with straw against the frost. He answered the knock at his door and looked at Caden, and something in his face shifted in the way of someone who has been waiting for a particular knock for a long time and had almost convinced themselves it was never coming. Caden showed him the sworn statement. He showed him his own signature at the bottom, the ink brown with 20 years of age, the letters still clear. Silas Ware sat down heavily in the chair beside his front door and held the document in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Outside, the early dark was settling over Providence, and the cold was coming in from the river direction, and somewhere on the main street, a wagon was moving over the packed earth with a sound like slow, patient thunder. "I was 23, Silas said. It was not an excuse. It was a fact offered without emphasis, the way a man states something that is part of the record rather than part of an argument. I know, Caden said. I should have. He stopped, started again. Your father. I knew what happened to your father. I knew it was connected. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that the document was gone, that no one would believe me, that Dodd would. He stopped again. Caden waited. I told myself a lot of things, Silas Ware said, for 20 years. He folded the document carefully along its original creases and held it out. Caden did not take it. I need you to hold on to that, Caden said, until tomorrow morning. Silas looked up at him. I need you there, Caden said. Not to do anything, just to be there. And if it comes to it, to say what you know. The old clerk looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a small, deliberate movement that had the weight of something much larger. Saturday morning was cold and clear. The sky, the deep wash blue that comes after storms, have scoured everything clean. The maple trees on the main street had lost most of their leaves in the storm, and they stood bare and precise against the morning light, their branches making complex patterns against the blue above. People came to the square because word had moved through Providence, the way word always moves through small towns, not through announcement, but through implication, through the specific quality of attention that 5 families showing up at Aldous Carver's farm on a Friday evening generated among their neighbors, through the way people who sense that something real is about to happen feel a pull toward it that they don't fully understand and don't entirely resist. By 9 in the morning, there were perhaps 60 people in the square. By 9:30, there were more than 100. Harlan Dodd arrived at 9:45. He arrived the way he always arrived, with the easy authority of a man on his own ground. His coat well fitted, his manner expansive, his expression set to the benign condescension he had been wearing in public for the better part of 3 decades. He had not been specifically invited, but he had heard there was some sort of gathering, and a gathering in Providence without the mayor's presence was, in Dodd's understanding of the world, an irregularity that required correction. He worked his way through the crowd, shaking hands, making the small observations about the storm damage and the river level that a man in his position was expected to make. He reached the space near the town pump where Caden was standing with Aldous Carver and Josiah Pruitt, and he looked at the 3 of them with an expression that had not yet registered alarm, only the first faint precursor of it, the slight narrowing of attention that preceded recognition. Voss, he said pleasantly, quite a gathering. What are we celebrating? The river gave something back, Caden said. He spoke loudly enough that the nearest ring of people could hear clearly. Then he began. He did not dramatize it. He did not raise his voice beyond what was necessary to be heard across the square, and he did not use more words than the account required. He laid out the sequence of events in the order they had occurred: the fire, the dollar, the deed, the boat, the door, the logbook, the key, the hidden compartment, the chest, the storm, the documents. He named what was in the chest. He named the families whose deeds were in it. As he named each family, he held the relevant deed up, then passed it to Josiah Pruitt, who received each one with the formal care of someone handling legal instruments, which was exactly what they were. The square was very quiet. He watched Dodd's face during this recounting and saw the sequence of responses move across it, like weather moving across open ground. The initial dismissiveness, the slow dawning comprehension, the tightening, the calculation, the assessment of options, the recognition that the options were limited. When Caden had finished describing the documents and what they proved, he produced the sworn statement. He read it aloud, all of it, including the description of the men at the Dodd warehouse and what had passed between them, including the account of what those men had been paid to do. The square was so quiet that the river could be heard. Dodd had regained something of his composure by this point. Not all of it, not enough, but sufficient to make an attempt. This is fabricated, he said. His voice was still controlled, still carrying the register of authority it had carried for 30 years. A dead man's document brought forward by a boy with no standing and nothing to lose. I am the mayor of this town. I have served this community so. Silas. Caden said the name quietly, but it carried. Silas Ware came forward from the edge of the crowd. He was wearing his clerk's coat, the one he wore to the office, and he was carrying the statement in both hands, and he was walking with the careful, deliberate movement of a very old man who has decided to do something difficult and is going to do it regardless of how difficult it is. He stopped in the center of the square. He looked at Harlan Dodd. "That is my signature at the bottom of what this young man just read," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The square amplified it the way spaces amplify things that people are straining to hear. "I was present when Captain Rowe wrote that statement. I witnessed what he described. I signed my name to it as a true account, and I have remained silent about it for 20 years. He paused. "I am not silent about it now." Harlan Dodd said nothing. He did not say nothing in the way of a man choosing silence strategically. He said nothing in the way of a man who has run out of things to say, who has discovered that the architecture he has built his life upon has a foundation that another man documented and sealed away in an iron chest at the bottom of a river, and that the river has just given it back. His face, for the first time in the memory of everyone watching, looked old. Josiah Pruitt stepped forward and spoke to Dodd quietly with the composed precision of a lawyer who has been waiting a long time for this specific conversation and has prepared for it thoroughly. What he said was not for the crowd. It was for Dodd and for the legal record and for the county sheriff, who had arrived sometime during Silas Ware's statement and was standing at the edge of the square with the expression of a man rapidly updating his understanding of the situation. The events of the days that followed had the quality of something unwinding rather than breaking. Not a collapse, but a disentanglement, the slow, patient process of separating things that had been twisted together for a long time back into their component parts. The deeds were verified. The registration records in Clarksville confirmed their legitimacy. The 7 families whose documents had been in the chest, the Carvers, the Hutchins, the Farwells, the Briggs, the Delacroix, the Wentworths, and the Galloways, whose deed Caden had not mentioned by name on Saturday, but who had been at the square, and who had wept quietly when he had found them afterward and pressed the document into their hands, began the legal process of reasserting their claims to the land they had been farming as tenants. Harlan Dodd did not fight it, whether this was because Josiah Pruitt had been very clear about the strength of the case against him, or because the experience in the square had broken something that had been under pressure for a very long time, or simply because the man had reached the end of the capacity for a certain kind of effort. Caden did not know and did not spend time speculating about. Dodd resigned the mayorship. The legal proceedings that followed were orderly and quiet and resolved over the course of several months in ways that did not need Caden's further involvement. The name Jonas Voss was a different matter. It was raised by Josiah Pruitt in a formal filing at Caden's specific request, a document entered into the county record that described what Captain Rowe's sworn statement and the supporting evidence established that Jonas Voss had been deliberately and fraudulently deprived of his property and his livelihood through the coordinated actions of Harlan Dodd beginning in 1871, and that his departure from Providence in 1872 had been the response of a man left without recourse in a town where the instrument of his ruination controlled everything, not the flight of a man who had failed by his own agency. The county clerk who processed the filing was a young man who had replaced Silas Ware when Silas had retired quietly the week after the square. He stamped the document with the county seal and entered it into the record without comment. But Caden stood in that office long after the clerk had gone back to his work, and he held the stamped copy in his hands, and he read his father's name in that official language. Cleared language, corrective, language, that said plainly that the thing people had believed about Jonas Voss for 20 years was not the truth. And he felt something release in his chest that he had not known until it released that he had been holding. His father had not failed. He had been failed. There was a difference, and it mattered, and now it was in the record. The celestial star did not become a working vessel again. What remained of its hull was too far gone for that, and the cost of restoration to operational condition would have exceeded anything that was practical. But a boat does not need to float to be useful, and Caden Voss was his father's son in the specific sense of being able to look at a structure that other people saw only as ruin and understand what it wanted to become. The lower hull still solidly embedded in its mud after the storm had resettled, it became the foundation of a warehouse. Not a grand one, a practical one, built on the boat's surviving bones and extending onto the bank with new timber framing that Caden designed and the Carver brothers helped raise through the early weeks of November. A place where the farming families of the surrounding county could store their grain collectively away from the individual granaries that had left each of them vulnerable to the price manipulation of river traders who played one farmer against another. The upper structure, rebuilt with seasoned lumber from a mill in Clarksville that gave Aldous Carver a fair price because Aldous now had collateral, again became a boarding house. Small, clean, with 8 rooms and a common room on the main deck level that looked out over the river through windows. Caden built himself using glass from Providence's Chandler and frames cut from white oak. He had learned to work the same way he had learned to work the door, carefully, patiently, with attention to what the material wanted to do rather than what he wanted to force it into. The bearer bonds from the chest financed it. Not all of them, most of them he converted through Pruitt's office into instruments that were placed in a trust for the 7 families' partial compensation for the income they had lost as tenants on their own land. But enough remained after all of it for what he was building. Old May Dunbar came by one morning in late November when the framing of the upper deck was going up and the smell of new lumber was competing with the river smell in the cold air. She stood on the bank and looked at what was happening on the water without surprise, which was consistent with her general approach to things. "The river takes and the river gives," she said, "but it needs someone to bring the giving ashore." Caden, 20 feet up on a framing beam, looked down at her. "You knew what was in that chest," he said. It was not quite an accusation. She considered this without embarrassment. "I knew Elias Rowe," she said. "Not well enough. He told me before the last run that he was carrying something important, that if anything happened to the boat was worth keeping." She looked up at him with those river gray eyes. "I didn't know you'd be the one, but someone always is eventually. The river is patient." She walked back to her shack without waiting for a response, which was consistent with her general approach to conversations as well. Cinder had a bed in the common room by general agreement and without formal discussion. He slept in it with the settled authority of an animal that has found the place it was always supposed to be in and has no intention of being anywhere else. His ribs were no longer visible. His coat, brushed out through the autumn by Ruth Carver's patient hands during the weeks her family had spent helping with the construction, had turned out to be a dark, warm brown that caught the light from the river windows in the late afternoon and made him look like something that had been specifically designed for this room. He still watched the door when strangers came in. Old habits. On a Monday in early December, cold enough that the river had ice forming at its edges in the mornings, Aldous Carver climbed the new gangplank that connected the bank to the rebuilt main deck and found Caden on the upper level finishing the last of the window frames. He stood in the doorway of the common room and looked around at what had been done and what was still being done, and his expression was the expression of a man who has not yet entirely caught up with the change in his circumstances, who still occasionally wakes at night expecting the old version of the world and has to find his way back to the new one. "This is something," he said. He was not a man who used words carelessly, and this was not a casual statement. It was a considered one. "It's almost something," Caden said. "Give it until spring." Aldous came further into the room, hands in his coat pockets, and looked out the window at the river, which was doing what it always did, moving indifferent, carrying whatever the land sent it downstream toward whatever waited below. "What do you call it?" he asked. "The place." Caden set down the plane he had been using and looked at the river himself for a moment. He thought about a silver dollar on a wooden counter. He thought about a sealed door and the smell of preserved air. He thought about a man who had kissed the top of his son's head one morning and walked out of town carrying the weight of what had been done to him and who had never come back and whose name was now in the county record as a man who had been wronged rather than a man who had failed. He thought about what it would feel like after a long time on the water to see a place where the river narrowed and calmed and the bank came close and there was somewhere to put in. "A harbor," he said quietly, "for people the river forgot." The window framed the Missouri in the late afternoon light, and the river moved through that frame the way it had always moved, without hurry, without apology, without particular awareness of the lives arranged along its banks. But there was a boat here now that was not dying anymore. There were windows with light in them. There was the smell of new timber and the sound of work being done, and in the evening, the sound of people eating together in a room that had been built for exactly this purpose. The river takes and the river gives. Sometimes it gives back what it should never have taken, and sometimes what it gives back is enough to build something that lasts.